Fred, thank you so much for joining us today and being willing to be our first person. And as your book implies, 3 continents and many years, you have a great deal to tell us, so we're going to start right away, if that's okay. Fred, you were born in Germany in 1928, 5 years before Hitler came to power, and a little over 11 years before World War II began. Before we turn to life under the Nazis and your family leaving Germany, tell us about your family and you in the years before 1933, before Hitler came to power.
Well, I was too young before 1933 to know much. But my parents had a business in the factory, and like many, they consider themselves Germans, just like all of you here are Americans, and you may be Christian, maybe Jewish, you may be Muslim. My parents at that time were Germans, and they were Jewish. They were, again, Christians, probably no Muslims, or not many. Germany didn't have many Muslims. But they were just ordinary citizens until Hitler came to power, and they were no longer ordinary citizens, if citizens at all.
Before we turn to that time, Fred, just a couple of questions. Your family had lived in the Königsberg area for many years.
Oh yeah, I've always tried to find out in what generation, how many decades or even centuries ago my family came to Königsberg. I have not been able to find out, but it was several generations.
At least 100 years, I think you told me.
I'm pretty sure, yes.
Yeah. And in your town of Königsberg, how large was the Jewish population there?
It was probably never more than 5,000 Jews. Mm-hmm. We had a large synagogue, and I think you
saw a picture of it earlier.
You saw a picture. And that was one of several synagogues, and they were the religious ones, the not so religious ones, and the Jewish community in Königsberg was quite active, and it participated in the city's life a lot, again, before the Nazis came to power.
Your father was a veteran of the First World War.
Yes.
What do you know about his service?
Very little. He was probably a health officer or something like that, but I know very little. He never talked about it.
Yeah. If I remember right, Sue's father was also a veteran of the First World War as a medic.
As a doctor, yes.
As a doctor. Tell me a little bit about your father's business. I mentioned earlier that had a fur business and made raincoats. Tell us about their clients.
I'm afraid I don't know much about their clients. There were other companies, businesses, but I was a child at that time, and I didn't. When I left Germany in 1938 or 39, I was 10 or 11 years old. So during the time that they had their factory, I was often in the factory, but who their clients were and what the operation was, I really don't know.
If I remember right, though, one of their clients was the German army.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing. Mm-hmm. The German government started boycotting Jewish businesses in around 1936 to 37. But the factory my parents had in East Prussia was so important that the army kept buying from them until 38, or possibly even until early 1939.
Despite all the boycotting
of Jewish business. No, they couldn't do without them.
Fred, if you don't mind, tell us why your parents named you Siegfried.
The interesting thing is that the German Jews, many of them felt themselves so German that their children were named after German heroes. Siegfried is the quintessential hero of Germany. And so I was called Siegfried. My older brother was called Manfred, which was another hero in Germany. Mm-hmm. But they wanted to make sure their children were identified as real, quote-unquote, real Germans.
Fully enculturated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, I can only compare this to American Jews who are Americans.
Right.
And before my parents were made aware. Now, I have to say that there was always a fair amount of anti-Semitism in Germany, in East Prussia even possibly more so. But it wasn't active. It was there, but it didn't impinge on their lives in any way. We knew it was there, but it didn't impinge on their lives.
And of course, all that would change, Fred. In 1934, the year after Hitler came to power, you started school just before your 6th birthday, and you wrote in your book, quote, "But after a few weeks, it was clear to me that I was different. I was an outsider," end quote. Tell us about that.
Well, almost the first day I came to school, I was the only Jewish child in my class. And I was, if not attacked, I was, in some ways verbally attacked, right from the very beginning. In particular, one particular child, I was sitting next to him, and he was the ringleader, if you will. But I felt my difference in the class all that year.
Yeah. And this you remember, even though you were
very much so. In fact, my mother was called to school twice or 3 times because of my reaction towards the class based on that. And I remember that very well.
I was struck when you shared with me that as early as 6 years old, classmates were already members of Nazi youth organizations.
I don't know if they were members of Nazi, probably they were, but certainly they were indoctrinated by their parents that we were inferior, that we were no good. Not all of them, obviously, but in fact, I have to say there was one child in my first class, I was about 6 years old, with whom he was nice to me, we were nice to each other, but for a Jewish child to have a non-Jewish friend in school was absolutely impossible. So I knew he was there, and that was about it. He couldn't be my real friend.
Right. You wrote also in your book that, quote, "Each day classes started with the Hitler salute, and the whole class shouted Heil Hitler, but that you didn't participate, which seems very courageous." What were the consequences for you?
Well, the consequences were no different in that I was Jewish and I was different all year, and the fact that I didn't say Heil Hitler was just one more thing. But the whole class stood up and said Heil Hitler every morning.
Fred, you said earlier that anti-Semitism may have been worse in East Prussia than even elsewhere in Germany. Besides what you experienced in that first year of school, during that time, right after Hitler came to power, what was life like for adult Jews in Königsberg, like your parents? What began to change for them?
Well, for one thing, we happened to live on the main street in Königsberg, and practically every day there were marches, and there were sometimes children, sometimes youngsters, sometimes adults, and their songs were always of 2 kinds. One is "Today Germany is ours," and very soon it will be the whole world. And the other was when we can eliminate the Jews, life will be so much better. And I heard that. I heard that from the very beginning, and I stood on the balcony with our maid. I have to say something else about that in a moment, but it's our maid. I don't know if she was in agreement with that or was not in agreement with that. Mm-hmm. She held my hand, and now, when I said I have to say something about it, after maybe 1936 or 38, I forget, Jews were no longer allowed to have maids. Why? Because I suppose they thought the male in the house would impregnate them, and there would then be half Jews born or whatever. But this maid that we had, she left in, I would say, 1936, 37, and after that we still had an employee, but he was a male. Mm-hmm. So
that was permitted?
The male was permitted, obviously, yeah, but the woman was not permitted to work in a Jewish household.
You were on the main street, and you were sharing with me watching, one of your earliest memories is watching the May Day parade of 1934. What do you remember about that?
I just remember the masses of people marching along and singing these anti-Jewish songs and the pro-nationalist German songs. Again, the main song was "Today Germany belongs to us, but tomorrow the whole world." How much they meant, well, I guess they meant it. It never came to pass, fortunately, but that was their aim anyway. That was their aim.
Your parents took you out of public school, as we noted earlier, and put you into a newly founded Jewish school. What was that like for you?
It was wonderful. Mm-hmm. The teachers were understanding. They tried to make us feel secure. They're obviously Jewish teachers. And the school was lodged in the big synagogue. I think you may either have seen a picture or you may see a picture of the main synagogue. And that's where the school was this newly founded Jewish school. And we felt perfectly secure, which I had never done in the 1 year that I spent in public school.
If you don't mind, tell us about the school, the organist at your synagogue, I think is Jacobus?
Jacobus, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Tell us about him.
I don't know much about him. He was the organist in our synagogue as far as I remember, when I was 5, 6 years old. Sometimes he would invite us children to come up and watch him when he was playing the organ, which was always very nice. And what his personal situation was, I really don't know.
I remember you sharing with me that I think at one time, because he was a Christian,
yes.
if I remember right, and Nazi stormtroopers came in front of the kids and began terrorizing him, I guess.
Yes.
Being the organist.
He went up, the organ was up above the altar in the synagogue, and they went up there and harassed him. He's a non-Jew working in a Jewish organization. There came a time when that was not acceptable. Mm-hmm. Thinking back and looking how Jewish children, grow up in America as ordinary children, ordinary citizens, not having to contend with all these problems, harassment that I had. But I was not the only one, mind you. It's just that I'm talking of my own experience, but all my friends and so on had the same experience. And I will have to say again, I said this earlier, I lived in East Prussia. The German Nazi Party had leaders of the Nazi parties in each part of the country, and they were called in German Gauleiter. The Gauleiter in Königsberg was one of the most rabid anti-Semites in Germany, mm-hmm. and the city reflected that. Mm-hmm. The party was extremely influential. The party at one time began to run the city, and this Gauleiter so there was a lot of anti-Semitism in my city. I have to say also later, at one point my parents felt it was too dangerous in some ways for me and my older brother to live in Königsberg, and they sent us to Hamburg, where they had acquaintances, friends. And in all my time in Hamburg, which was close to a year, I never ever had an anti-Semitic incident. So the difference was the Gauleiter mm-hmm. in each particular city. And Hamburg was quiet, peaceful. I'd never any incident in Hamburg during the time I lived there.
So dramatically different than
Königsberg. It was absolutely like day and night.
Yeah. Fred, you wrote in your book that in the early years of Nazi power, during those years in Königsberg, there were always people leaving. the circle of family and friends grew ever smaller. Will you tell us more about that?
Well, children in school with whom I was friends suddenly disappeared. They were gone. For my parents, the same way. They had friends, adult friends, and suddenly they were no longer there. Mm-hmm. And they became, I guess, how shall I say it, somewhat lonely when you start losing your friends. Mm-hmm. Until we ourselves were able to leave. Luckily, we were able to leave too.
Before they left, you said that the key issue for all Jews in Germany generally, but certainly in Königsberg, was should we stay or should we leave? How did your parents weigh that question?
My parents really didn't want to leave. Mm-hmm. I forget which one of them wanted to leave, the other one said no. But imagine this now. My parents they were not wealthy, but they had a factory in Königsberg which gave them a good living, upper middle class maybe, if I can characterize it that way. When they had to leave, in our case, they went to a country where the language was not German, but was Spanish. They didn't know how to earn their livings. They had 2 children, me and my brother, who was a little older. And we came to this new country. They didn't know the language. They didn't know the culture. They had no way to earn their living. It must have been frightening for them. So I guess they had an idea what would happen if they left Germany. So they were extremely reluctant to leave Germany, until in some ways they were forced to leave. And luckily for us, they had an employee in their business who tried to really literally kill my father because he had embezzled a lot of money. And in some ways, the Jewish community helped my parents to leave, and us, the family, to leave. Had it not been for that, we would have stayed in Königsberg and we would have been killed in the Holocaust. So the intent to get rid of us saved our lives.
And I want to come back to that in a minute. As awful as things were and got worse and worse with each passing year, as it was for your family after Hitler came to power in 1933, things became even far worse with and after Kristallnacht, or the Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass, which took place in November 1938. On that night, Jewish businesses and homes were ransacked and vandalized, and synagogues were burned all over Germany. What happened to your family as a result of Kristallnacht?
My father was imprisoned. Mm-hmm. He was imprisoned for, I don't know how long a time, probably several weeks. And they were lucky, because all over Germany, Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. In concentration camps, many of them lost their health, sometimes their lives. And they came out oftentimes physically severely damaged. Königsberg was too far from the closest concentration camp, and the cities themselves apparently had to pay for the transportation of Jews to the closest concentration camp. Königsberg didn't have the money for that. So what they did is they jailed the men. There were, I don't know, I understand up to 6 in one cell, but they were undercover. They were not out in the open. Mm-hmm. And none of the Jews who were incarcerated were physically damaged in jail. They came out, those who had ways to leave came out sooner than those who didn't have any means to leave yet, or leave at all. And they stayed for many weeks, maybe a couple of months. Mm-hmm. But my father, again, was lucky that he wasn't sent to a concentration camp. And
if I understood correctly, along with your father, a young cousin of yours was jailed, a 14-year-old cousin. Right?
Yeah, that was also. I had a cousin who lived in a small village near Königsberg, where I was born. And on Crystal Night, the boy was jailed, 14 years old. Like the Germans tried to jail all the men on Crystal Night. In this case, they jailed a 14-year-old boy. And he was sent to us in Königsberg from the village where he was living, and to keep him safe. But what happened is my parents had tried to send me to what's called a Kindertransport, a children's transport. The British, the English accepted children on these transports to get them out of Germany and keep them safe, and I was slated to go on one of those. But my cousin was so much in danger that my parents yielded my place to him on this particular transport, so he went to England and I stayed in Germany until my family luckily was able to leave.
Tell us, Fred, about your own memories of the morning of November 10th, after that night of terror of Kristallnacht.
First of all, the first thing I noticed was that somebody first of all, let me say what happened. Many of the apartments, buildings, and businesses in synagogues were ransacked and just oftentimes completely destroyed. In my case, my family was lucky. The Nazis came into our apartment and did no damage. Why? I don't know. But they arrested my father, like they arrested all males that they could get hold of. The first thing I remember is that I was woken up by two strange men who came into my room, looked at me, and I guess my brother too was still there, and closed the door and left. But when I woke up and I looked out the window, the street was full of broken glass. Hence, this was called Crystal Night. The street was full of broken glass as they had invaded other buildings, apartments, broken the windows and destroyed many things. We escaped it. We were lucky. Nothing happened in our apartment. Our windows were still there. But that was the first thing I remember. I went out and walked to our synagogue, I don't know, maybe half an hour walk or so, where also our school, the Jewish school was, and it had been destroyed, set afire. And this is how I experienced the Crystal Night.
What did your mother do after your father was jailed?
She worried.
She worried, yeah.
But the main thing was that, she was, again, the men in Königsberg were just in jail, not in concentration camps. So the women were able to collect blankets for them and took them to jail and made their stay in jail easier that way. And that was, I guess, the only thing they could do. There was nothing else they could do.
After that night, your synagogue was burned. You shared with me, and I think you wrote about this in your book too, that your 10-year-old boy, you would make trips to the ruins of the synagogue.
Yeah, I have to tell you that the synagogue was essentially destroyed, and the school that functioned in the synagogue no longer was able to function there. Next to the synagogue, almost next to it, the next building was a Jewish orphanage. And the school was located from that day on in the Jewish orphanage. But the orphanage, there was a patio in front of it, and there was a fence, and the fence led into the synagogue, but the fence had a hole. And for some reason that I really today don't understand why, I oftentimes went from the orphanage, climbed through that hole, and went into the synagogue.
By yourself?
By myself, and I never found anybody else there. But the synagogue the roof was totally destroyed. There was a lot of water all over because when this synagogue had been set afire, the people who tried to put out the fire, the firemen came and there was a lot of water. But for some reason, I do not know how, I was 11 years old, 10 years in the beginning, 11 years old. I don't know what attracted me to go there. Now, something very important happened to me there. I don't know if you know what the Torah is. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses written on a scroll. The scroll is handwritten, must be handwritten, and is about 3-4 feet high. I have a children's Torah, and I found this Torah in the rubble of the synagogue, and I picked it up, took it away. Nobody else was in the synagogue, nobody else was looking for anything. I took it and I kept it to this day. It's a very important memory of my life in Königsberg and what happened after Kristallnacht. So this Torah, I try to see if I can open it for you to see if you have never seen a Torah. The real Torahs are, again, handwritten, 3 feet or so high, and every synagogue has to have one. Without a Torah in the synagogue, there is no synagogue. And I don't know if you can see. It's printed in Hebrew, but the real ones are handwritten in Hebrew. And again, this is a very important memory for me of that time, and I guard it very safely, and I bring it out to an occasion like this.
It's traveled a long way with you.
It has traveled a long way with me, and
After that night, after Kristallnacht, you had said that there was no question then for your family. You had to get out of Germany. So your parents started making serious plans to emigrate to Chile after that. But those plans that they had made to leave did not work out and those plans seemed to have come to an end when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and World War II began. Tell us about the family's efforts to try to go to Chile, and then it didn't happen, and you felt, as you put it, felt trapped.
At that time, when the need was greatest, most of the countries in the world had closed their doors to Jewish refugees. And when you say that my parents made efforts to go to Chile, it's not quite true. They made efforts to go anywhere, wherever they could go. And as it turned out, my parents had been great philanthropists to the Jewish community. And in any case, there was this man who tried to put my father in jail a few, and that's another interesting thing. On Kristallnacht, the Jews were forbidden to own firearms. And one day after Kristallnacht, the man who wanted to get rid of my father in the business opened the safe in the presence of witnesses, and lo and behold, there was a gun in the safe. Now, that would have been an immediate cause for the Gestapo, the secret police, to send my father to the concentration camp. My father was cited to the Gestapo for a hearing 2 days after this event. And strangely enough, I in a rare case, the Gestapo officer said, I don't believe. The man who tried to accuse my father was called Meyer. I don't believe Mr. Meyer. He is framing you for some reason. Why was he framing?
This was the Gestapo officer
the
saying
Gestapo.
this.
Was he framing this man? Why was this man framing my father? Because he had embezzled a whole lot of money from the factory, and obviously he didn't want to be found out.
So he sticks a gun in the safe and
He
says...
sticks a gun in the safe, trying to get rid of my father because my father would be sent to the concentration camp. Mm-hmm. The Gestapo officer who interviewed my father 2 days later said, I don't believe Mr. Meyer. I don't think that gun was yours. So, but he had no choice. He had to give my father a time to leave Germany. Mm-hmm. He could no longer just simply sweep this under the carpet. So he gave my father a number of months to leave Germany. My father appealed to the Jewish community, and this was mid-1939. Mm-hmm. And the Jewish community agreed to help my family to leave Germany. Now, again, most of the countries in the world had closed their doors to Jewish refugees. Some countries, in this case Chile in South America, the doors weren't wide open, but they accepted some refugees. Mm-hmm. And the Jewish community, actually it wasn't really my parents, but the Jewish community arranged for our leaving Germany. They got the visas, they got the tickets for the ship, and this attempt to get rid of my father saved our lives. Without that, we would have stayed in Germany, we would have been caught up in the Holocaust and killed as so many other Jews were in the Holocaust.
So with those plans made, unfortunately on September 1st, when Germany invaded Poland, the war began and you weren't able to go to Chile at that time. Did you believe, when that happened, did you believe that your hopes to go to Chile or anywhere
Absolutely. My parents had hired a teacher to teach me and my somewhat older brother Spanish to go to. Chile was not necessarily on the horizon, but South America was. And when that happened, these lessons stopped. And we were sure that we would no longer be able to leave Germany. Even I, as a child, how old was I? 1939, 1938, I was 10 years old. I knew we were trapped in Germany and we would never be able to leave.
So you yourself felt that sense of loss of hope?
Absolutely. The anti-Semitism and the attacks and so on were so pervasive, so every day, that even we as children participated in the fear of what would happen to us in Germany. Of course, the Holocaust itself was in the future. Nobody knew what really would happen in places that nowadays is called Auschwitz, but there are many other camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka and others. That was all in the future. Nobody could have imagined that a civilized country like Germany would implement and establish these extermination camps. It was simply unheard of. It never happened in history. It never happened in the world that a country like Germany, cultural country like Germany, would establish these camps and one way or another kill 5 to 6 million Jews. It was unimaginable. And while there was a lot of anti-Semitism and whatnot, nobody could imagine this. So when we were able to leave in 1939, we didn't know what we really were escaping.
Before we turn to your actual leaving, I was really struck when you said to me that once the war began and you thought that was it, you wouldn't get out and you'd lost hope, you then turned your attention to preparing for war. And you were here, you're an 11-year-old boy. What do you remember what that meant for you?
Well, for me, it meant mostly to buy food.
Mm-hmm.
We thought, I mean, I didn't know the larger implications of this, but the thought was that if war came, there would be scarcity of everything.
Right.
So I tried to, with my child's money, whatever I had, buy as much food as I could and bring it home.
You also shared with me that your little bit of money as a child, you bought a flashlight.
Yes, that was also important.
Yeah.
You know, if we lost electricity,
Right.
I would need a flashlight. Anything that a 10-year-old child can think about that might happen if something like this was occurring.
And as it turned out, of course, as you said, you were able to get out, you were able to go to Chile. And as you said to me, it was nothing less than miraculous that you were able to get out. Tell us about leaving Germany, how you were able to do that.
Again, I think I mentioned this before. This employee of my parents tried to frame them. He tried to frame my father that he had embezzled money and whatnot, and hoping that he would be sent to a concentration camp. And he himself had stolen a lot of money from the factory. Because my parents had been philanthropists to the Jewish community for a long time, and my father was jailed on Crystal Night, 10th of November in 1938. When he came out of jail, the Jewish community, remember this was long before the Holocaust. Right. People couldn't imagine the Holocaust. Yes, people wanted to get out of Germany, but it wasn't like they knew they would be murdered, as it was a few years later.
Right.
So the Jewish community agreed to help us to get visas to most countries that were closed. Was impossible. How the Jewish community got these visas for my family to go to Chile, I shall never know. Mm-hmm. But it was a Jewish community that was able to get these visas, and this is how we got to this country called Chile.
There's so much you could tell us about the details of that. You left about 6 weeks after the war began. You were able to get out. One of the things you shared with me is that the Nazis allowed you to take only a little bit of money, but your father got around that somehow. Share that.
Yeah, we were allowed, I believe, something like 10 marks per person. 10 marks at the time was like $2.50.
Per person.
Per person. So there were 4 of us. We were allowed to take out 10 marks. But my father had some cash at home, a fair amount of money. Now, you couldn't cross a border with that fair amount of with that money. He would have been caught and jailed. When we got on the train the ship that we were going to take to South America left from Genoa in Italy. When we got on the train to go to Genoa, my father went to one of the bathrooms and hid the money, whatever money he had, in the bathroom. So when they crossed the border, when the train crossed the border, he went back into the bathroom, retrieved his money, so that we weren't wealthy, but we had at least a little more than $2.50 per person as we came to Chile.
And he did that at great risk.
At great risk, yeah. And also the fact that we had a little money. I don't know what. That money was mostly spent on the trip. We were on the ship for 6 weeks. Remember, at that time, people didn't travel by airplanes. They traveled by ships. So we took a ship in Italy, and it took us to Chile. Valparaiso is a port city in Chile, and it took 6 weeks. And whatever little money my parents had now because of the stratagem of my father was mostly spent during those 6 weeks as we entered ports and went off the ship, maybe bought some food, whatever. But by the time we came to Chile, there was very little, if any, of that money left. Now, what happens now? The community in Königsberg must have notified the Jewish community in Santiago in Chile that we were coming. Just not us, but other people too. When we came by ship to Valparaiso, there was a woman waiting for us. And she took us by train to Santiago, which was a 4-hour train ride or something like that. And when we got to Santiago, she took us to what's in German called a Pension. It's a place where you live, where you have a room, but where you also get your meals. Again, arranged by the Jewish community. So she took us to the Pension and left us. So at least we had a place to stay at night, and we were safe, and we got the food. The Jewish community must have paid for that. But let me just tell you a little bit what happened next. How were my parents going to make a living? In Germany, they had a rainwear factory, so they had some understanding of things to wear, to clothing and so on. My father decided that the best thing to make a living in Chile was to open a factory, if you will, to make women's wear. How do you open a factory? Well, the Jewish community there gave my parents 2 sewing machines. In that one room where my brother, myself, my parents lived, suddenly there was a big table to cut clothes and 2 sewing machines. And the room where we lived, so-called, became a factory. Mm-hmm. So when I was sick, and my brother was sick at one time, the seamstresses came and went and came back with the clothing that they had sewn in their own homes overnight. Came back, picked up more material, and so on. This was what the Jewish community arranged that for us, and we were lucky. We were really, really lucky that. Now imagine, we were children. We accepted it. It wasn't. I was 10 years old, 11. My brother was 3 years older. One more thing. My brother started working at age 14, the day we came to Santiago, and he never had any formal education after that. Mm-hmm. I was more lucky. I was able to be in school for another 3 years, and I started working at age 16. Mm-hmm. So at least I had a little time. I was 11, and I started working. I was 15 or something like that. So I had at least a little time to
adjust,
get to know the country and learn the language and so on.
Fred, we're getting close to the end, and I want to leave a little time, if we can, for the audience to ask a couple questions. But I want to ask you just a couple of more. When you left Germany 6 weeks after the war began, you were close to the last of any Jews that were able to leave, weren't you?
Yes, there were in the city where I lived, called Königsberg. Well, whoever was left of the Jewish community, some of these people still were able to escape, but the great majority of them were caught up in the Holocaust, mm-hmm. deported to somewhere east of Germany and murdered. Mm-hmm. And amongst them were many of my friends, many of the friends of my parents. Mm-hmm. Now, it's fortunate, my immediate family, we survived. But if I think myself as a child, I lost friends, but my parents lost relatives and really close friends by these people not being able to leave Königsberg and being deported and murdered in the German camps. If I think back today, how the Germans could have done that, establish these camps exclusively, the exclusive purpose of these camps was to murder people. And of course, as we all know now, they were successful with 5 or 6 million people. Even today, at my age, after these many years, I can't understand. I can't understand how a country like Germany, one of the most, quote, cultured countries in Europe, came to do that and came to be successful in murdering so many people.
Fred, if you don't mind, let's turn to our audience and see if they have some questions for you.
Absolutely.
I'm going to ask that if you can, stay with us for the few minutes of questions, because Fred will close our program out in a few minutes. So we invite you to ask a question here. We have microphones in the 2 aisles. If you have a question, try to make it as brief as you can, and I'll repeat it just to make sure everybody hears it, then Fred will respond to it. So we have a brave soul already. Okay.
Thanks so much for being here and for sharing your story. Really appreciate it. It was very emotional and moving. And I just wonder, how do you reflect, based on your history and your wisdom, on current situations with other religions, other cultures, and the hatred culture that we currently live on?
I think that, go ahead, Fred.
That is a very difficult question, because I know of no country at this point that was so violently intent on murdering people like Jews as Germany was at that time. I can't answer that question because I see no real identity in between what happened then and what happened now. So I really can't answer that properly for you.
I'm going to also mention that when Fred finishes, he will stay up here on the stage, and we invite anybody who wants to come up on the stage and meet Fred, ask him another question, get a picture taken with him, whatever you want to do. So please do that. Do we have any other questions? Anybody want to ask a question? If you don't mind coming to the mic, we'd appreciate it. I know that's a little scary. Oh, go ahead. You just ask the question. We'll try to hear it.
What do you think brings someone to hate? Like, what kind of sickness does it take to, like, genuinely, truly hate someone or a kind of people? I feel like that's the root of how all of this has happened, and I want to know. I mean, I don't know if that's something that you can question and not great. I don't know if that's something you can really pinpoint, but what do you think is the source of that?
That's a great question. The question is, what do you think causes that kind of hate?
No, I'm going to be a psychologist. I don't know. There was always a certain amount of anti-Semitism in Germany. How it came to escalate, how the Germans came to establish these camps, these multi-murderous camps, I don't know. I don't have an answer, because today, after all these decades of years, I ask myself the same question that you asked. It is an extremely important question, but I have not found an answer to that. Mm-hmm. It's maybe if you ask a real psychologist, people have analyzed that. And you can read books, and they say, it's for this reason, this reason. Nothing has convinced me to understand how this could have happened. I can't understand it.
I believe it was Elie Wiesel who said about this museum, this is not an answer, it's a question.
It's a question.
Which is a very profound statement. Again, if you have a question, please come up on the stage and afterwards, and feel free to ask Fred that. Thank you all for being with us. I'd like to remind you that we'll have a first-person program each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August, so we hope you can come back. We have 2 more programs in April that will be live-streamed. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So with that, I'd like to turn to Fred to close our program.
It's very difficult to finish a program this way. The question I ask myself, why me? Why was I saved? Why was I able to survive and so many of my friends and so many other people who I don't know, but also so many of my friends, my family friends, were unable to survive? I think it was simply a matter of luck. It was luck that to be at the right place at the right time, to get the right visas and whatnot. I'm grateful. I'm really grateful to I know to whom that I was able to survive that way. And that's an important question. The other question is, of course, that was asked a moment ago, why? How did all this happen? How did all this happen in a country like Germany, mind you? Again, one of the most cultured, if that's a proper word, countries in Europe, maybe in the whole world. I don't have an answer. I wrote a book about my experiences and so on. And at one point, I wrote a chapter about Germany, and then how we immigrated to Chile, and how eventually I met my wife in Chile, and we came to America. I asked myself in that book, how could this have happened in Germany? And I asked it in the book. I ask it today. I ask it every day. I don't know. I don't know. That's about the only answer I have. I'm not a psychological professional, and I can only reflect on my life and on the luck that I had, that I was able to survive, come to first to Chile, where I met my wife, then to America, where we established a family, 3 children. And he had a wonderful life. Our expectation, my expectation as a child in 1938, 39 in Germany, were 0. What in fact we had is our lives, my life since, has been anything but what I could have expected. It was fantastic. In Chile, life was very, very difficult for my parents to make a living, to start making a living in this country without language, without anything, was very difficult. For us children, we went to school, eventually we got jobs, and our lives, I met my wife, and we had a wonderful time together. And again, we came to America. We came to America more out of a sense of adventure than anything else. We were going to go to Israel. I think it was Israel already, not Palestine. And we felt all our friends had immigrated to Palestine, Israel, whichever. My wife and I decided, we want a little adventure. And we will come, the excuse for us was we will learn something in America that we can use in Israel to earn our living. I think, thinking back, it was simply a sense of adventure. We came to America for maybe to stay 6 weeks, 6 months. Well, this is now about 60, 70 years ago, and we are still here. We really, really loved it here. It was a country like no other we had ever been. You could open up. Let me tell you one experience. Is it time?
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, one quick experience. We had been in America, I don't know, a few months or something like that. I was walking on Broadway in New York, and there was a table. There were two people who were accused to be spies at that time. I forget their names. And they had set up a table to support these people because they thought they had been framed. And here I was not a citizen. I had recently come to this country, and they had a big piece of paper for people to sign a petition to let these people go. I forget their names. And here I was, maybe 6 months in the country, and I signed that paper. How could I have ever thought that in Germany, certainly not, and in Chile was semi-democratic, I would never have signed anything like it. I felt free to sign that here. It was an experience I had never, ever had before, that I could do something like that and not be punished, not have secret police after me and jail me because I'd signed that piece of paper. That was, to me, today, in memory, a tremendous experience of what this country was like. The country seduced us and stayed. And here we are.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you. That's a great story.